Let me now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Charles Murray, who is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He is one of the nation's leading authorities on a number of the topics that Bill Galston also addressed in his lecture. Things like marriage, family, social mores, social stratification, culture, and crime. He did his bachelor's degree at Harvard University, his PhD in political science at MIT, and he's a noted libertarian philosopher. He first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of a book called Losing Ground, dealing with many of those issues I just mentioned. It's been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, which we were discussing earlier this afternoon. His 1994 New York Times bestseller, The Bell Curve, was co-authored with the late Richard J. Herrnstein and sparked heated controversy for its analysis of the role of IQ in shaping America's class structure. Murray's other books include What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment, In Our Hands, and Real Education. His most recent book, and the reason we wanted him to address you today on this theme of America and the question of decline, is a book called Coming Apart, published by Crown in 2012, describes an unprecedented divergence in American classes over the last half century. It's our great privilege to welcome Dr. Charles Murray.
Well, and it's a great privilege for me to address this particular group. And I'm also sandwiched in between two of the people that I most admire as social commentators, so I will do my best to hold my own. With regard to the question of national decline, I come at it from a somewhat different perspective than is usual with such questions, because ordinarily if you're talking about national decline, you're talking about a shrinkage of economic clout, a shrinkage of diplomatic or military clout, other kinds of standard indicators for saying that a country is going downhill. In the case of the United States, I am certainly not an expert on international affairs. Let's just put it this way. I don't see anything that's inevitable about diplomatic or military decline, nor do I see anything inevitable about economic decline. We've had problems coming into the 21st century, but I don't see those as being systemic and things we can't recover from. However, the United States is different. It is unique in terms of nations. There was a great phrase by a noted historian, Hofstadter, blocking on his first name, Richard Hofstadter. In an interview, he once said, "It has been our destiny as a nation not to have ideologies, but to be one." And what he was referring to is the extraordinary extent to which the United States was an idea, as opposed to a physical place when it started, and the extraordinary unanimity that accompanied that. There is a wonderful letter from Thomas Jefferson written toward the end of his life when he was asked to discuss his thinking as he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he says very openly, he says, we weren't trying to say anything new. We weren't trying to say anything novel. Everything that I expressed in there had been hackneyed about, that was his phrase, for years. And then he has the phrase, we tried to express the American mind. And in effect, what you had with the creation of the United States was a unanimity that individuals hold very broad individual rights, that governments will inevitably extend their power unwarrantedly unless they are restricted by the most stringent means, and that if the government is not expressly told it has the right to do something in the Constitution, it doesn't have a right to do it. All of this was commonly understood. So you had differences among people like Hamilton and Madison in terms of the role of the federal government, but it was like this far apart in terms of their overall understanding of what the country was about. And in that sense, we had what many people have called in the past, and I'm going to call today, the American Project. The American Project was not about economic growth. The American Project was not about political power abroad. It was the notion that individual human beings can be left free to live their own lives as they see fit and to join voluntarily with their neighbors and communities in solving their own problems. Americans have disagreed about the extent to which the government should engage in those issues as well, but that is, I think, a statement of the American project that at least until recently would have gotten very broad spectrum of support from across the ideological spectrum in the United States. And my proposition is that the American project is in grave danger. I'm not going to try to make that case on the basis of tactical victories and losses from a libertarian's point of view. I'm going to make it from what I hope is a more analytic point of view, which does not depend on me being a libertarian and is based on a fairly cold analytic description of the facts. Because what we have seen in the last 50 years, 60 years, is something new under the sun when it comes to the United States. We have seen a divergence of classes in this country that is different in kind from anything we have seen before. And that runs counter to some of the deepest strengths of the American project in the past. More specifically, we have seen the formation of a new lower class, different from lower classes in years past, and we have seen the formation of a new upper class, different from upper classes in years past. Let me start with the new lower class. And I'm going to be comparing, at this point, the upper middle class with the working class. Upper middle class is not the same as the upper class. Upper middle class refers to about 30% of Americans these days who have college education and are in the professions or in a managerial job or are married to such a person. That's upper middle class as I'm defining it. Working class consists of people with no more than a high school education and who are working in a blue-collar job or a low-level service job. I am further going to put two other limitations on the numbers I'm about to give you. One is I'm going to be referring exclusively to non-Latino whites, as I do throughout the book. Why? Because if I gave you the national numbers for the indicators I'm about to discuss, every single one of you would quite reasonably be saying to yourself, okay, to what extent is Murray talking about a national problem? To what extent is he talking about a problem that's concentrated in the black community or the Latino community or something else? By talking about non-Latino whites, all of those complications go away. I'm also limiting the numbers to people ages 30 to 49. And the reason for that is there have been lots of changes in the culture whereby people get married later than they used to. They retire earlier than they used to. The 20s and the 50s have changed somewhat culturally. 30s and 40s are as they have always been. In your 30s and 40s, you're a grown-up. They're the prime of your working life. This is the time people raise families and get ahead in the world and all the rest of that. With that in mind, let's start with what I call the founding virtues and see what's happened to them. Well, I call them the founding virtues. Historically, you know, the better label for them would have been the Republican virtues, because the founders did talk about the Republic, but if I call them the Republican virtues in the book, I knew I was going to alienate half of the population who don't like Republicans, so I'm calling them the founding virtues. The reason that I call them that is that even though the founders were united on the form of government that they thought should take place, they were also united in saying the Constitution was not a sufficient guarantee of making that government work. Explicitly, every single one of them, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, you go through the whole list, Adams, Franklin, the rest, all of them said that the Constitution will only work with a people who possess certain virtues. There were some differences among the founders as to their whole list of the virtues they thought were important, but there were four that every single one of them talked about in one way or another. Those four were industriousness, marital morality, honesty, and religiosity. In the case of marital morality, what they were really talking about at that time was fidelity within marriage, and also marriages that were not arranged marriages. They saw marriage in the United States as being a fundamentally superior institution to marriage in the decadent countries of Europe. Industriousness, the word they used was industry, which refers not just to working hard, but it refers to the whole idea of getting ahead, making a better life for yourself and your family and the rest. Honesty, Jefferson liked to refer to plain American honesty, again in contradistinction to the decadent European countries. Religiosity is the most interesting because the founders were not really particularly religious. Adams was pretty much not only a practicing, but I think a devout Christian. Jefferson was explicitly a deist. Washington and Madison went to church regularly and said all the right things, but they were a little vague about their fidelity to the details of doctrine. They were men of the Enlightenment, after all. But they despite these aspects of their behavior with regard to religion, all of them said that you cannot have a limited government without the force of religion as a basis for moral behavior and self-restraint. And they stressed the self-governing nature of the people, not in terms of self-government of communities, but self-government of the individual. Okay, let's go through the 4 founding virtues and see what's happened from 1960 to 2010. Marriage. Let's start out with that one because I think that's probably at the bottom of a whole lot of our problems. In 1960, in the white upper middle class, ages 30 to 49, 94% were married. It is not often, those of you who are sociologists in the audience know that you get an institution that gets 94% participation. That was true in 1960. But for the white working class, same age group, you had 84% who were married. Marriage was the overwhelming norm through which communities functioned and through which children were raised. 50 years later, in 2010, in the white upper middle class, you still had 84% married. It had dropped, but you know that number, about 84%, had been steady since the mid-1980s. And not only that, divorce had been going down during that period. So the fact is that marriage in the upper middle class is actually in very good shape right now. In the white working class, where it had been 84% in 1960, by 2010 it was 48%. That's a minority. Something like a third of all males ages 30 to 49 have never been married. It is very difficult. Again, I will appeal to the sociologists in the crowd to back me up on this. It's very rare that you see first that kind of dramatic change in a basic cultural institution that fast, but also the divergence. So now you have 84% of the upper middle class married, 48% of the working class. Huge disparity. In many ways, the story for industriousness, is as dramatic. Now, the role of women in the workplace has changed, revolutionized from 1960 to 2010, so I'm going to leave them out of it. But in 1960, to be a real man in the United States, if you were in the prime of life, you either had to be working or looking for work. If you were not doing either of those things, you were considered a bum. You were considered a bum by your parents, by your girlfriend, by your spouse, by your neighbors, and by the nation as a whole. You were morally deficient if you were not in the labor force. As a result, guess what? Just about every male was. By 2008, I picked that year because I want to antedate the recession. Now, I'm using the March CPS numbers, so these came out before the recession hit. As of 2008, you had about 1 out of 8 white males ages 30 to 49 who was not even in the labor force. 1 out of 8, about 12%. Furthermore, that figure had been rising in good years and bad. We can talk in the Q&A if you want to about the role of globalization and stagnation of wages in the working class, and what role that these various things have played. But I will simply give you a preview of what I think is my most telling argument. If you say to me that if we get an economy that has low unemployment with lots of jobs at wages well above the minimum wage for low-skilled workers, and not only do we get that economy, but that we will have that economy for several years running, we will fix a lot of these problems that Murray's talking about with white males and the labor force. If you take that position, I am then going to say to you, I just described the last half of the 1990s. We've been there, done that. We had several years of an extremely hot economy with lots of help wanted signs up for low-skilled jobs, and they were paying way above the minimum wage. And during that period of time, the kinds of numbers I'm talking about failed to get the slightest bit better with males changing in the workplace. What we are talking about is a change in the work ethic, a change in the culture that exists now in the working class. And the only people who don't recognize that, as far as I am concerned, are academicians who never talk to people who actually live in working class communities. It is not rocket science. Go down to a working class community and go to the local bar. Do not take your clipboard and a questionnaire. Sit there for a few evenings and just chat with people and drink beer with them and talk, and here's what you're going to find out. You're going to talk to a lot of males who not only are not working and not looking for work, they'll be quite open with you that they don't particularly want to. They are managing to get along, and they're never going to rise much in the world, but they don't want to take on the kinds of work that they're qualified to do. And you also, if you talk to women who did not marry the father of their child, and you ask her why she didn't marry it, you are not going to marry him. You are not going to hear her say that, gee, Joe, just feels it's not right to get married when he can't support us, and even though he's tried hard to get a job, he can't find one. What you are going to hear instead is something like this. Why should I marry that bozo? He's a nice guy. He's fun in bed. But to bring him into the family would be like bringing another child into the family. We have a real problem with males in this country behaving like adolescents well into their 30s and beyond. I'm not saying that's limited to the working class, okay? There's a lot of that going around throughout this culture, but it certainly has become a major problem in the working class, related not just to the workforce, but to marriage. Honesty, I won't go through this in detail. We've gotten so used to crime numbers going down, and most of us live in parts of town where there really is no crime, that we don't tend to think of crime as a problem anymore. Violent crime rates in the working class neighborhoods of this country are still at levels of 4 or 5 times what they were in 1960. 1960 in working class neighborhoods, you could still leave your doors unlocked. Kids could be playing unsupervised safely. Those things simply are not true. There has been a drastic increase in the disorganization that exists in working class communities. Religiosity, here's a surprise. Surprise to me anyway. I have always assumed and bought into the conventional notion that the working class is the bedrock support for religion in this country. It's not true. It's true that the elites have become extremely secular. That's true. But the upper middle class, which is not the elite, that's just college educated, but it's a much broader segment of the population, religiosity has declined, but it's declined vastly more in the white working class. So that now if you take as a measure of religiosity that you report that you go to church regularly and that you feel a strong affiliation with your faith, you're down to about 1 out of 8 whites in the working class who say they do that. When you're talking about 1 out of 8, you are now no longer talking about a large minority of people who help set the standards for a community. You are talking about people in a community who are increasingly seen as oddballs. In all of those cases, there has been a big divergence between the upper middle class and the working class, and furthermore, that has reflected itself not just in statistics, but in the way these communities run. A lot of you are familiar with Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, published around 2000, in which Putnam documented a severe decline in America's social capital. Putnam did not try to break that out by socioeconomic class. I did do that in Coming Apart, and once again, the upper middle class, it's not clear that social capital has gone down much at all. It may have, but in the working class, it is again plummeted. Part of that is really understandable. Why is it that men coach little league teams? Why is it that women are active in the PTA, that you go to the city council to lobby for a 4-way stop sign, that you do all the other things that are part of social capital? A whole lot of that has to do with parents trying to create an environment for their children. And when you don't have marriage, a lot of the human capital that becomes available when you have 2 partners in a marriage is no longer available. Plus, there are lots of cultural differences. I mean, you'll have a hard time finding an unmarried man, unmarried father who coaches Little League teams. And unmarried moms don't have time to go to PTA meetings. Furthermore, Robert Putnam documented that about half of all social capital in this country is directly religious in nature. And not only that, people who are religious also tend to engage in secular forms of social capital far more than secular people do. So when you have that kind of drop in religiosity, you're also going to take a huge hit in social capital. So the net result is you've got working class communities which no longer meet the founders' definitions of what is required in a people to be self-governing. They are there's a growing population. Self-government doesn't work for them anymore. Let me turn from them to the new upper class. The new upper class is the result of two phenomena throughout the 20th century, one of which was actually very good and welcome, and the other one of which was certainly not bad. The welcome one was that in the mid-20th century, America's universities got a whole lot better at identifying intellectual talent wherever it was and pulling it into the best colleges. It happened rather suddenly. In 1952, my alma mater, Harvard, incoming freshman class, the mean SAT verbal score was 580 something. By 1960, just 8 years later, the mean SAT verbal score was 680 something. In the course of 8 years, Harvard switched from being a school with a lot of rich kids, some of whom were smart, to being a school with a lot of really smart kids, some of whom were rich. It was a huge transition, and the same thing went on throughout the university system. What happened in all the other Ivy League schools happened in the elite schools, but then as time went on, it also happened in the large public universities. And I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't seen the same thing in the service academies, which I don't really know specifically. But in the large public universities now, not only is it harder, a lot harder than it used to be just to get in to the University of Iowa or the University of Maryland's main campus, they have honors programs within those universities. So if you are in the University of Michigan's honor program, your credentials are real close to those of kids who are getting into the Ivies. That's all good in the sense that you want kids with talent to get a chance no matter what their background is. But it can lead to problems. Before I get to what those problems are, let me talk about the second force that went on in the 20th century, which is that brains became much more valuable in the marketplace. Which is to say that a really high IQ attorney who has all the other kinds of non-cognitive skills necessary to be a great attorney, a really high IQ attorney of that description was able to make a whole lot more money in the 21st century than 100 years earlier, because of changes in the economy. In 1920, there was not available to an attorney the opportunity to broker through very complex means a multinational merger. Those kinds of things just didn't happen. Now you do have that kind of opportunity, and they can be worth commissions of millions of dollars. Here's an example. The young person with really super high visual, spatial / mathematics skills, but who is a complete social klutz. I think most of us have met such kids. They are so bright in math, and they are so clueless as to how to deal with other human beings. 1920, what could that kid do? He could become an actuary. Maybe he could become a math teacher, but being a teacher requires some social skills. What can he do now? He juggles a six-figure offer from Google versus a wealth beyond your wildest dreams of avarice offer from the Quants in New York City, if he's really, really first rate. In a much larger sense, that same skill set, visual spatial skills / math skills in the IT revolution and in the investment revolution are worth lots and lots of money. Happen throughout the occupational structure. For that matter, if you're in the service, look at the cognitive demands of being a leader in today's armed forces versus the cognitive demands 100 years ago. You simply have a whole bunch of things that have happened that are qualitatively different from the kinds of things that leaders had to deal with a few generations ago. Okay, you take those two things, put them together, what's happened then? Well, you have all of these really talented kids that are being drawn together in settings where they socialize with each other during college, where they share all sorts of things in common. And as people who share all sorts of things in common, especially cognitive ability, tend to do, they start to develop their own cultural mores and tastes and preferences. Nothing wrong with that. It's very ordinary. But it's a kind of concentration of talent of a particular kind that we had never seen before. And they're also making a lot of money when they go out in the workplace. Among other things, they marry each other, which also is completely, it's good. I mean, it makes sense to marry someone who's similar to you in cognitive ability. For one thing, if you marry someone who is at least as smart as you are, that spouse will get your jokes a whole lot more often than if you marry someone who's not as smart as you are. If you marry someone even smarter than you are, something that, I'm not making a joke here, I did it, and I'm being quite serious. I married someone smarter than I am. You never have to explain yourself. Now, you never have the excuse when you're talking to somebody else of saying, my wife doesn't understand me. But you also are in a position of she always understands what you're trying to get across. This is all great, but it also means another kind of concentration of talent that has some effects. For example, the upper class gets stickier in terms of its tenacity to retain its own position. Used to be shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, okay? Because you had some really clever person who made the money in the first place, and his kids weren't all that smart and not all that able, and they lose all the money. Well, couples now are passing down talent along with the money. If you don't think that this kind of marriage assortment is taking place on a broad scale, go to the internet, pull up last week's Sunday Times. I haven't looked at it, but I'm sure it'll vindicate me. And go to the page they have every Sunday showing marriages, also known as the merger and acquisitions page. It's fantastic. You know, here is Harvard MBA, now a partner at McKinsey marrying Yale lawyer, Yale educated lawyer who's a partner at some important New York law firm. I mean, it just happens all the time. Here's what difference that makes in terms of social structure. In 1960, as today, you had certain neighborhoods in this country, which is the place where the rich and powerful people lived. Northwest Washington was like that in 1960, Upper East Side of New York, southern Westchester County, North Shore of Chicago, Beverly Hills / Bel Air in California. That's where the rich people lived and the powerful people lived. So I took 1960 census tract data, and I determined the median family income and the percentage of adults with bachelor's degrees in 14 of these elite neighborhoods. The median family income in those 14 elite neighborhoods was $83,000, and that is expressed in today's dollars. That's not affluence, let alone wealth. Now, it's not that the rich people didn't live in those places, but there were lots of other people living in those places as well. The median family income on the Upper East Side of New York, defined geographically exactly the same way it is today, median family income was $59,000 in today's dollars in 1960. Percentage of adults with college degrees was 26% in those elite neighborhoods. I have just described the way in which there was built-in socioeconomic heterogeneity even in the most exclusive places in the country. That's gone away. Same 14 neighborhoods, 2000 census tract data, you're up to $163,000 median family income, which means you don't have nearly as many people who aren't quite affluent. You're up to, maybe misremembering this number, I think it's 76% of college degrees. But it's not just that. I also did an analysis of 16,000 graduates of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale with their zip codes, their home zip codes as of the time they were 40 to 50 years old. And they are concentrated in a very limited number of very elite zip codes. You want to get a sense of how concentrated it is, our nation's capital is the place to go. Most of you in this room are familiar with the Washington, D.C. area. You know what I mean when I say that if you're a mover and shaker in Washington, D.C., I have a very high probability of knowing where you live. You live in Northwest Washington, Bethesda, Chevy Chase, maybe Potomac, McCain certainly, maybe Great Falls, parts of Arlington. That's where you live. A couple of people on Capitol Hill, a couple of them are in Alexandria, but basically I've described where they live. There are 13 zip codes in those areas I just described. I constructed an index which combines family income and educational level for every zip code in the country and ranked them from top to bottom. Out of the 13 zip codes in the Washington area I described where the movers and shakers live, 11 of them were not just in the top percentile of zip codes in the country, they were in the top 0.5% of the top centile, and the other 2 were in the top 1.5%. But it's not just that. At this point, the zip code index scores for the zip codes surrounding those neighborhoods have also gotten to stratospheric levels. Take the 95th percentile of zip code and above as constituting a class of what I say called super zips, all right? You now have contiguous super zips around Washington, D.C. that extends west into Loudoun County, north well into Montgomery County, to the northeast well into up toward Gaithersburg. Overall, there are contiguous zip codes in the top 5 percentiles that have more than 1 million people. What does that mean? It means that you have larger and larger numbers of people living in bubbles, upper middle class bubbles, that give them very little contact with the rest of America. That is true, by the way, of all 4 metropolitan areas where the most powerful, influential people in the country live. It's true of Washington, D.C., true of New York City and its surrounding suburbs, true of Los Angeles, California, and it's true of Silicon Valley. Those are the 4 centers where if you're anybody in the worlds of politics or the economy or the entertainment industry or journalism or the information technology revolution, you very probably live in one of those 4 areas, and you live in a bubble. The problem is not so much living in a bubble right now. The problem is if you have only lived in a bubble throughout your entire life. I guess maybe I should precede that by describing a little bit more of what I mean by a bubble. What's the difference? There are lots of differences. If your kids have gone to elite public schools and you go to back to school night, if it's an elementary school, you will see almost no women who are mothers of elementary school children in a school in the bubble that are still in their 20s. You'll see very few in the first half of their 30s. Most of them will be late 30s or 40s because that's when they have kids, much older than the rest of the country. The guys can be any age up into their 60s. If you think about television viewing habits, the average television in this country is on, I think, over 30 hours a week, all right? I'm not saying that it's great to watch 30 hours of television a week, but you certainly are getting a whole lot of popular culture in the course of watching that much. In the new upper class, what is their attitude toward television? You get essentially a couple of different attitudes. One is, we don't actually have a television anymore. You know, a couple of years we just got rid of it. Another one is, well, we have a television, but we use it to watch DVDs. And Downton Abbey. Yeah, we watch Downton Abbey. And we watch Mad Men, too, but basically that's it. Okay, they don't watch the same TV. They don't listen to the same radio. They, well, I have a quiz that I finally gave in the book. It has 25 items in it. And the reason I gave a quiz in the book is that a lot of these things I couldn't prove quantitatively about the isolation of the new upper class because the data on the sales of who buys Bombay Sapphire Gin, those data are available to the makers of Bombay Sapphire Gin, but they aren't available to scholars like we are. So I just asked questions in hoping that my readers would realize if they were in a bubble. So I have questions such as, for example, this is a serious, sober one. Have you ever lived for at least a year in a neighborhood where more than half of your neighbors did not have college degrees? I have lots of questions like that. I have questions which sound frivolous. Have you or your spouse ever bought a pickup truck? In the last year, have you or your spouse ever stocked your fridge with mass market American beer? The new upper class hates Coors and Budweiser. Their disdain for mass market American beer is just palpable. You know, if their beer is not made by Belgian elves, you know, they are not going to buy it. It has to be just the right color. And okay, so that's kind of silly, but it does get at a real point. But questions like, have you ever walked on the factory floor? Get at something else. Not have you ever worked in a factory floor. Have you ever walked in a factory floor? I have one question which has the military insignia of 5 different ranks. I have, I think, Major General and a Sergeant and a Corporal and a Bird Colonel and a Captain. And so how many of those can you identify? Amazing. I didn't think it was possible for a guy. I can imagine that women don't get to be, teenagers not knowing military insignia, but how can a guy not get to be? But they don't. They don't know. If I had to mention one question I think is the most telling in the 25-question quiz, it is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? Because if you have not done that, you are fundamentally unable to empathize with a whole lot of the population. For that matter, one may say that if you've never held a job that causes a body part to hurt at the end of the day, in some basic way you don't know what work is. Okay, the scores that people get on that can be pretty high, which is good to get a high score, for people who have grown up in a working class neighborhood or a middle class neighborhood. Because they may live on the Upper East Side now, but they still remember what it was like in a working class neighborhood in Pittsburgh, or grow up on a farm in Kansas or whatever. It's their kids that are the problem. Kids who have been born into the upper middle class or higher, who have always gone to selective schools from K through 12. They go from there to selective colleges. During the summers, they don't wait tables in Montana. They get internships at Brookings Institution or the AEI or someplace like that. They go from there to graduate school, and they go from there seamlessly into a career, all the time living in a bubble. And the problem is that these are the people who are increasingly running the country. I do not make this as a Democrat versus liberal versus conservative statement. Conservatives and liberals equally live in the bubble and suffer equally from it. The problem here, if you're talking about the survival of the American project, is that they increasingly have a couple of different attitudes that become endemic. One is they lose respect for ordinary Americans. It can be a very obnoxious kind of snobbery, which I have encountered as I've given speeches like this to members of the new upper class. More often, it takes on a condescension that, well, the reason we have to have such and such a policy is because we can't expect some poor schlub out there to make these decisions wisely on his own. He needs our help. They have no idea what ordinary people are capable of doing because they've never known ordinary people. If you've gone to selective K-12 schools, you know what? The dumbest kids in your class are probably above the national average in IQ. And the extension people take from that is, gee, you know, the rest of these people must be really stupid and not able to deal with the world. That's one problem. And another problem, beside the condescension and the ways that causes them to interfere in people's lives, the other problem is they don't have a clue what the priorities of ordinary Americans are. You know, it's asymmetrical. If a truck driver doesn't understand the priorities of a cabinet official, that doesn't make any difference because the truck driver cannot affect the cabinet official's life. The cabinet official can't affect the truck driver's life. And it's really important for him to understand what's going on. And also, it's important for the whole idea of America to have a sense of being Americans together with an identity that transcends socioeconomic class. And we used to have that. I know I'm sounding too nostalgic and too idealistic. I'm not ignoring issues of race and of other kinds of people being systematically excluded. All of these are well-known parts of our history, but there is another well-known part of our history, which is that to a remarkable degree, Americans did not want to be seen as members of the upper class. And they would go to great lengths to avoid it. There were the lodges and the various kinds of organizations in the 19th century and early 20th century, ones that had millions of Americans in them, whether you're talking about the Moose or the Elks or the many other ones, which people don't even think of today as except sort of working class social clubs. They used to be much more than that, and they used to engage people across the socioeconomic spectrum. You used to have a lot more daily interaction between bosses and workers than you have today. There are all sorts of ways in which the people who were on top didn't want to be seen as getting too big for their britches as well. Those of you of a certain age in this room can think back to let's say 1960, and if you were in a town like I was, which had a large corporation, my father was an executive in that corporation. None of the executives owned Cadillacs. It was the Maytag Company in Newton, Iowa. Fred Maytag, I don't think, had a Cadillac. And the reason that they didn't have Cadillacs was that a Cadillac was too ostentatious. It was setting yourself apart. They certainly didn't consider building 12,000 square foot homes, even though they could afford to do it, because that would really be out of line. There was a sense of unseemliness that constrained a lot of behavior. Well, I want to leave enough time for questions, so I should bring this to an end quickly. I do not have a happy ending to this. It is possible. The United States has had reawakenings, mostly religious reawakenings, but also some civil reawakenings that have turned this culture on a dime. I'm thinking of like the religious Great Awakening of the 1820s, which changed the alcohol consumption per capita in this country, just slashed it hugely, and also gave rise to the abolitionist movement. You had the Civil Rights Movement, which went from pretty much a standing start in 1954 to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in just a decade. So it can be done. But I increasingly see as the problem that we face a new upper class that's perfectly happy with its position as an upper class, increasingly able to pass it on to their children, increasingly oblivious to a lot of what has made America exceptional, and a new lower class that is growing and that is increasingly unable to participate in American life as we have known it before. The appeal that I make to members of the new upper class is not that they should sacrifice their self-interest, but that they should start to think about what their self-interest really is. I put it this way to some of them. I say to the audience filled with very successful people, I say, think of all the things that have made you what you are, and then ask yourself to what extent you are systematically depriving your own children of the experiences that made you what you are. And I also ask them, to what extent have you gotten very good at living a glossy life, but at the cost of a life that has a lot of texture to it? And both of those make some headway in terms of an audience of 100 or 200 people. But it is through conversations that spread across millions of people that cultural change takes place. And the only thing I can do to spark that cultural change is to write books. And so that's what I've done. Thank you very much.
Questions, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Brett Maxfield. I wonder if one, I know this isn't complete, but it was a contradiction in what you're saying there. You mentioned the fact that our elite colleges have become much more merit-based from what they were originally as clubs of the elite. And that is some avenue for social change, so that the children of elites, even if they're above average in a great school, if they can't cut the bill, in an elite school, they still can't graduate to higher jobs. And secondly, you mentioned, I think it's a fundamental problem, that the cabinet secretary can affect the life of a trucker, but a trucker can't affect the life of the cabinet secretary. However, that trucker and every single American, the majority of who don't have college degrees, is charged with selecting the leaders of our country, and that is who our politicians are talking to when they try and set policy.
Two large questions. The first one has to do, and I'm just going to approach this in a purely statistical basis. You are absolutely right that children of the elite who aren't so smart are not going to get into Harvard, Princeton, Yale the way that they used to, even if their parents did go. Legacy isn't what it used to be in that regard. So it's not a case that all the kids of the elite will perpetuate their parents. They will regress to the mean. But think in terms of who is going to produce the next generation of 140 IQ kids. So even though the average child regresses toward the mean, two parents that both have IQs of 140 are a whole lot more likely to generate a child with an IQ of 140 than two parents with an IQs of 100. And so the population that goes into these schools and graduates from these schools is very, very densely populated with the upper middle class and even the upper class now. There is a strong argument to be made that Harvard today is much more uniform in a socioeconomic sense than it was when I went there in 1961 to 65. And that's true of a lot of other schools. Socioeconomically, the racial diversity, they got that all taken care of. But socioeconomic diversity is really shallow at those schools. So the problem that I'm talking about, I think, is self-sustaining over time. In terms of truck drivers and across the country being responsible for electing their cabinet officials indirectly, yeah, you're right. The problem here is that democracy ain't what it used to be in that regard. You first have very low voting rates among the same working class. Remarkably low voting rates. They do not constitute a kind of voting bloc that they used to. The second is a more subtle problem. I mean, people very seldom go to the polls and say, I'm going to vote for or against this person because this person, how shall I put it? It's not on an abstract level, all right? If you're a single woman trying to raise children, you are going to vote on the basis of issues about how you're going to be safe. And those are going to call for a whole bunch of very pressing economic interests you're going to have. And so you are not probably going to vote for people who are going to get off your backs in terms of trying to tell you how to live your life. Got to make it a short answer, or else I could go on with that for a long time.
Yes, sir. Quick insights. Something I didn't hear you mention, I walked through this, was the dynamic playing out in fights and countries' wars. I was on an elite scholarship, and out of 32 of my classmates, I'm the only one whose son has gone to the war in Afghanistan. I was on an elite fellowship, and out of 16 couples, I'm the only one whose son has gone to the war. Any data on that the elite's children are not fighting the wars, and that this, all volunteer force is really economic conscription of the middle and lower middle class?
I don't know of really good numbers on it. My anecdotal data are exactly the same as yours. My friend Bill Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, God bless him, his son is a Marine officer, and I have another friend who's a billionaire, and his son went to Iraq as a Marine officer. That's it. I'm just exhausted of all my friends in the elite, those who've had kids go into the military. I'm really scared about that. Yes, sir.
I had a comment question that previous point. I teach at a very elite liberal college, and I was asked by Secretary Powell there what was going on college campus, and I said, well, I could better organize the kids on my campus have to have a demonstration about Darfur, then I could organize them to have a demonstration either in favor of or opposed to the war in Iraq. Because they weren't going there, they didn't know anybody there, the parents weren't paying any taxes for the thing, so for them it was almost irrelevant. They can get excited about their story. So that's the comment. Question, do you see any hope, though, in sort of the homogenizing or the opportunity? There's a big series, New York Times, New York Times book review for the New York Times review section. Last week had a very extensive thing on the growth in, online education. Now, many colleges, even places like Harvard and Yale, are now offering a lot of these courses now online. So there seems to be a transformation going on. That is the area of most dramatic growth in college education, part due to the overwhelming burden of cost. Is that potentially, I'm sure there's not data on that yet, the possibility to kind of homogenize this as an opportunity for the future?
Well, I'm going to resist here going off on a 10-minute rant about our higher education system. I have written a book on this subject, and I've also published an op-ed with the title "The BA is the Work of the Devil," which might give you sort of a sense of where I'm going. But to answer your question more directly, higher education is going to be transformed because of the kinds of things that you're talking about. These are market forces that are going to drive this. There is going to be a transformation of college below the elite level. But parents will still be lined up, elite parents will still be lined up to get their kids into the Ivies and to Stanford and Duke, etc. And they will continue to play, I think, for the foreseeable future, this kind of gatekeeper role that they are establishing as, well, these are the places you've got to go to school if you want to get a leg up. I don't see that changing as a result of this. The rest of the educational system will be transformed. There is, however, the only hope there is, will parents ever start to figure out that they're raising hothouse flowers? I mean, you've got these kids who are very, very smart and very, very able. I talk to them when I go to college campuses, and they remind me of crystal vases, which are beautiful, but if they drop, they are not going to bounce at all. And I'm not saying this, by the way, because I've got a military audience in front of me. You go to those same schools and you talk to kids who've been in the military and then gone to school, and a couple of things stand out. First, the teachers will tell you that those kids are getting so much more out of their classes than these other kids are. And the second thing is, the ones who've been in the military will roll their eyes at their classmates, in terms of material and the rest of that. I just throw that in. That's a true statement.
So my Colin Agee from Army G2. My daughter's on the faculty at Thomas Jefferson, the magnet school. And so in light of what you said, I want to ask you about some issues that I discussed with her and that she deals with. One is this hyperselectivity, even 4 years before college, if you think that's a healthy thing to nurture the very academically elite. And then the other is they have perpetually controversial issues about diversity there, because when I visit the school, it's predominantly Asian, and they can't get even a smattering of blacks and Hispanics because they can't qualify, and they're continually pressured to rectify that. Your thoughts?
Either one of those questions get a 15-minute answer. Okay. First, my own attitude toward selective education in K-12 is that in 1989 I moved my family and 2 young children out to Burkittsville, Maryland, and my kids went to the local public schools because I did not want them to be in schools where they were surrounded only by kids like themselves. And my view is that if you go to an elite college and if you've been to an average high school, you're behind for about a semester, maybe a year, in terms of the ones who've had the better preparation. You catch up. And the second thing that happens, if you go to an elite college after you've gone to mediocre public schools, you are so excited to be there. Whereas a lot of these kids are burned out. If they've gone to Thomas Jefferson, they got to Harvard, and they're jaded, they're burned out. And so my answer is, as a parent, I want my kids to be able to function in the United States as it exists, in all of its wonderful diversity. Speaking of diversity, then, the racial issue of what's that, that plagues magnet schools and the elite colleges too. I got in a great deal of trouble when Dick Herrnstein and I talked about some of the facts in this issue in the bell curve back in the 1990s. The bell curve was not about race, but we had one chapter about racial differences. in cognitive test scores. Don't have to talk about whether it's nature or nurture, whether it's genes or environment, doesn't really make any difference. The fact is that when you get time to have people applying to Thomas Jefferson, there are facts on the ground in terms of preparation, which means you're going to end up with the distributions that you observe, insofar as the admission is grounded on academic preparation and ability. That's just, it's one of those things that people just go nuts when you try to deal with this directly and honestly, but it's a fact. It's not the end of the world, it just has to be dealt with.
One more, sir.
One more? Okay.
Richard Schoenfeld, I'm at West Point. You may have begun to touch on this a bit at the end when you invoked your rather lovely metaphor of textured versus glossy lives. But I'm curious about what might seem to be a tension in your remarks. On the one hand, you champion sort of the American project and the pursuit of the freedom to pursue one's own interests. On the other hand, you seem to lament the passing of certain social norms and mores that might, according in the eyes of some people, at least be considered constraining. So I'm going to assume you probably don't want to legislate things like marriage morality or religiosity, but then I'm just curious what you think the way forward is. If this is the way society is trending, how would we change it without interfering with the American project?
You know, libertarians believe that people should be free to choose any lifestyle they wish with one proviso. They got to pay for it. So I submit as a proposition to you that in a strict libertarian state, where the state has no engagement whatsoever in trying to promote marriage, discourage it, subsidize, anything else, in a pure libertarian state where the state has no interventions at all, marriage is going to be the overwhelming norm across the entire socioeconomic spectrum. And why is that? Because a lone woman with a child is not a viable economic unit. Yeah, if you've got a Harvard MBA, you're a viable economic unit, but very few single mothers fit that description. In the ordinary way that things work, having two parents makes it a whole lot easier to live a secure life and die comfortably. And in a libertarian state, marriage is going to do great. Labor force participation is going to be 100%, unless you're paraplegic. And in other ways, my argument is that the kinds of cultural phenomena I want, and communities will be very tight-knit, because there are lots of ways in which in a libertarian state you really want to cooperate with and engage the cooperation of others to solve problems. So this is the last question, and I will close on an explicitly ideological note, that the reason that the United States in the past had such strong cultural institutions was not despite, but because of the very limited state that we had. It's been a real privilege to speak to you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We have a little something here from the Stockdale Center. It's a compass. We like to call it the moral compass. But yours seems to be pegged north, and we're happy to see that. But maybe somebody will come to your office that's a little bit shaky, and you can kind of point out to it and say, take a look at the compass before you open your mouth next time. But you gave us a lot to chew on here, some real ethical dilemmas and some real tough challenges. And thank you very much for your presentation. A round of applause for our doctor.